Everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Lash to the Mast. Just one announcement. I'm going to be doing a special feature on the Ukrainian-Russian war that's going on right now in about a month's time or so. It'll be a special edition, not part of the political podcast, but keep your eyes on that, and yeah, I hope it'll be really informative for you guys. All right, well, with that, let's turn it over to the philosophy portion of the podcast. Um, in this podcast, we'll review the last podcast briefly before reviewing Heraclitus' position of dynamic monism and the first Thomistic thesis. So, if you guys remember in the last podcast, philosophy podcast, we examined Parmenides and Zeno's position of static monism before reintroducing the concept of potency. And then, if you remember even further, Parmenides argued that since being can't come from non-being, and since the only thing that could qualify or separate being from itself is non-being, which by definition doesn't exist, then pure being must be all there is, because non-being can't modify it if it doesn't exist. Um, but if pure being is all there is, and there's nothing to qualify or modify it, then change must be impossible, since change under this framework requires non-being coming into being, which is impossible. Although this is a seemingly absurd conclusion, it actually follows kind of logically if you agree that pure being is the only existent thing and that something can't come from nothing. So, and then his student Zeno backed it up with these two famous paradoxes, which we looked at in the previous episode, the dichotomy paradox, where he posited that it's impossible to go from point A to point B because to get halfway to point B, you need to get halfway to point B, and then you need to get halfway to point B, and so on and so forth. So it's impossible to get to path to position B. And then he also had the paradox of parts, which is that anything with a specific, or anything like a rock, like a rock with size must necessarily be infinitely large, because there is an infinite number of divisions you can make in such a thing as like a stone, and therefore must be infinitely large because all of those infinite ways of cutting it all add up to infinity, and there isn't really an end to them anyway. So um, so those arguments reinforce Parmenides' claim to static monism. But fortunately, for those of us who wake up in a cold sweat pondering these things, Aristotle solved this apparent conundrum by positing the idea of potency, which is a sort of midway point between being and non-being. And again, this is what the last philosophy video was about. So I'm going to be developing potency a little further here, but please go check out the other one too if you haven't. So to be more specific, potency is defined as a capacity for a certain type of change and is a real aspect of a thing. If you remember Parmenides' definition, he and Zeno denied the reality of change. So if Aristotle can pull this off, then with this idea of potency, then he can explain how change happens. And so this is a really big deal. And yeah, so he's making the point here that it's not potency is not can't exist without something existent already there. Like it needs to be like grounded in something already existent. But if you have something already existent, then potency can modify it, and this thing can tend to change in certain ways. Like for example, let's see, like a snake shedding their skin, like that they have a natural tendency to do that. They have the capacity. There's a potency that they have to wow, I just forgot what the word was, but to get rid of their skin. That would be a real potency. And that's just to back up once again the definition that potency is defined as a capacity for a certain type of change. Okay. It is also the ground for counterfactuals such as how something could behave or could have behaved. So potency is the reason why we know that if you boil water, then, or if you boil an ice cube, it's going to turn into water, because it has that tendency to turn into water upon the actuality of the heat acting on it. So this potency solves the false dichotomy raised by Parmenides and the paradoxes of Zeno by not by denying the premise that something can't come from nothing. Aristotle is fully on board with Parmenides and Zeno when they say that something can't come from nothing. Aristotle completely agrees with that. But he argues that is not what change is. Change doesn't involve non-being coming into being. It involves potency coming into being. And the technical definition for that is called the actualization of potential, where that's kind of a really fancy term, which just means existence making something else, acting upon something else to make it behave in a way that it tends to behave. So yeah, and then as I mentioned earlier, boulders, they have a capacity for rolling down hills, for example, upon being pushed, but not flying like a kite, exploding, or turning into a werewolf or any other crazy thing. If you push a boulder, it's going to go down the hill unless inertia is just too strong. Okay, so that about does it for the review. Let's take a deeper dive into dynamic monism now, as contrasted to the static monism of Parmenides and Zeno. Okay, so in direct opposition to Parmenides, Heraclitus takes the position that only change exists, i.e., there is never anything stable or permanent in reality, but only endless becoming. This position is known as dynamic monism, in opposition to the static monism of Parmenides and Zeno, where dynamic refers to the constant change going on, and monism to what exists in this case. Reality under this idea is just a constant flux of the smallest particles imaginable, which do not coalesce into anything stable. Sorry about that. According to dynamic monism, because only change exists, there can't be anything permanent or stable, and anything which appears to be stable, such as my self-identity and my knowledge of people and their being, it's all an illusion. There are no abiding things such as animals, rocks, planets, or human beings, or anything else. What we mistakenly believe to be a thing is really just a bundle of unrelated things morphing into a completely unrelated bundle of related things, and so on. Like it's just chaos at every single level. So as you can see by comparing this static monism to this dynamic monism, the former argues that change doesn't exist. So this is Parmenides and Zeno arguing that change doesn't exist, while the latter, Heraclitus, within dynamic monism, argues that change is all there is. So to put it in Aristotelian terms, to put it in technical terms, static monism accepts act but not potency, whereas dynamic monism accepts potency but not act. We debunked static monism in the last episode by introducing potency, and in this episode we will debunk dynamic monism using the definitions of potency that we learned and act. All right. First things first. If you'll remember the first episode of this podcast where we talked about isolating being as a food critic would isolate ingredients at a Taco Bell, then you will remember that act refers to that which exists. Because actuality exists and potency, because actuality exists and potency is the only capacity for being, actuality must be prior to potency. So, i.e., actuality can exist without potency, but potency can't exist without act. It kind of went back to what I was saying earlier, where you can have this act right here, and then the potency kind of is grounded in it and specifies the directions or the ways in which it tends to change. Here's an example. It is because a certain piece of wood is flammable or technically inflammable. I don't know which one to use. It has the capacity to be burnt. That is, this flammable piece of wood burns, and it is precisely because a jug of water is inflammable that it doesn't burn. Like, this is, just common sense. It is the kind of thing that is which. Oh, sorry, I'm tripping over myself here. Um, yeah, so potency is the kind of thing that determines whether the material, can be set on fire or not. No, sorry, act is. Oh my gosh. Sorry, guys. This is really, really bad. Let me back up here. Yeah, I'm stuttering a lot today. So, all right. Let me go back to the piece of wood. It is because a certain piece of wood is flammable, i.e., it has a capacity or potency to be burnt, that it burns, and it is precisely because a jug of water is not flammable that it doesn't burn. It is act is the kind of thing that determines whether or not the it can be set on fire or not. It is, in other words, it's the thing that grounds the potentiality. Without something already actually determined, there would be nothing for potencies to modify or qualify. So if that piece of wood like didn't exist, then you couldn't set fire to anything because there wouldn't be anything to set fire to. Pretty simple. Uh, okay, and then going back to Heraclitus's dynamic monism, we can now see the reason why potency can't exist on its own, but has to modify or qualify something already actual or existent. Um, Heraclitus's denial of actuality and his dynamic monism's denial of actuality is therefore impossible, since the potencies being referred to are not grounded in actuality, not even in the tiniest particles. So remember dynamic monism and what Heraclitus was saying, change is the only thing there is. Well, that would, in Aristotelian terms, that would mean a potency is all there is. But potency can't exist without act. And so the kind of world that Heraclitus is imagining is literally impossible to imagine because there's no act. There's nothing to separate that potency from non-being. Um, yeah. So let's see. Okay. So in light of these explanations of potency and act, we are now ready to examine the first Thomistic principle again. And I know you guys are ramped up for the first Thomistic principle, which states that potency and act so divide being that whatsoever exists either is a pure act or is necessarily composed of potency and act as to its primordial and intrinsic principles. Let me read that again slower. Potency and act so divide being that whatsoever exists either is a pure act or is necessarily composed of potency and act as to its primordial and intrinsic principles. So let's break it down. Contrary to Parmenides and Heraclitus, being is not the only thing that exists. And contrary to Heraclitus, potency is not the only thing that exists. Rather, it is both potency and act which are required to understand existence and change. That's why the first part of this thesis says, potency and act so divide being that whatsoever exists either is a pure act or is necessarily composed of potency and act. Which it just means that everything that exists can be classified as either just pure existence or as a mixture of potency and act. It's very once you understand potency and act, then it makes a lot of sense. It's basically the Aristotelian rebuttal to both Parmenides and Zeno, or Parmenides, Zeno, and Heraclitus. Okay, if you remember as well from our argument against Heraclitus, potency can't exist without something already actual for it to be grounded to. Finally, okay, let's look at the last part of this quote, as to its primordial and intrinsic principles. Now, what on earth does that mean? A primordial principle simply refers to that which is most basic to a thing, which is its existence. After all, if something didn't exist, there wouldn't be anything there to begin with. So, and then as for intrinsic principles, that simply means principles within a thing which determine how a thing behaves, which, as we saw earlier, is simply potency. So, in conclusion, then, Parmenides and Zeno's acceptance of act but not potency, and Heraclitus's acceptation of potency but not act, are two opposite views which imply absurd things about the world we live in. To remedy the situation, Aristotle agreed with Parmenides and Zeno that change could not involve being coming from non-being, but argued that that is not what change is. Under Aristotle's view, there is a middle ground between being and non-being called potency, which is grounded in the thing itself and determines its behaviors. In addition, it is not true that Aristotle would agree with Heraclitus that change is all there is. Rather, Aristotle puts both act and potency together. Change for Aristotle, then, is the bringing of potencies into being, or to speak more precisely, the actualization of a potential, if you'll remember that phrase from earlier in this episode. This leads us directly to the first of the 24 Thomistic theses, which states that potency and act so divide being that whatsoever exists is either pure act or is necessarily composed of potency and act as to its primordial and intrinsic principles. In the coming weeks, we will be examining how exactly potency and act work together and what, further develop the distinction between them. You will probably be doing that through Ed Fazer's book, Aristotle's Revenge, and Joseph Owen's contemporary or Christian introduction to metaphysics. But we'll see, how that goes in the future weeks. Well, thank you guys. That should about do it for the philosophy portion of this podcast. So now I will turn it over to the political side.